The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany table as Princess Catherine adjusted her posture for what felt like the 100th time that evening. The state dining room at Buckingham Palace buzzed with the quiet conversations of diplomats, ministers, and foreign dignitaries, each word carefully measured and diplomatically precise. Catherine's emerald evening gown rustled softly as she reached for her water glass, her movements graceful yet somehow constrained, like a bird with clipped wings performing a well-rehearsed dance. Across from her, the ambassador from France was regaling the table with stories of his recent visit to the Loire Valley, his animated gestures causing the silverware to catch the light. Catherine found herself genuinely interested in his tales of ancient castles and vineyard tours, her eyes lighting up as he described the centuries-old wine cellars carved deep into limestone cliffs. She leaned forward slightly, her natural curiosity overriding years of rigid protocol training. "Your Highness seems fascinated by our French heritage," the ambassador noted with a warm smile, clearly pleased by her attention. "Have you had the opportunity to visit the Loire region yourself?" Catherine's face brightened, and, for a moment, the carefully constructed mask of royal reserve slipped away. "Oh, I absolutely adore France," she began, her voice carrying genuine enthusiasm. "William and I spent the most wonderful long weekend in Provence last spring. We rented this tiny cottage overlooking a lavender field, and every morning we would walk through the village market buying fresh bread and cheese from the local vendors. There was this elderly woman who sold the most incredible honey, and she taught me how to identify different varieties just by their color and consistency." The words tumbled out freely, each memory painted with vivid detail and infectious joy. Catherine's hands moved expressively as she spoke, no longer the controlled gestures of a royal, but the natural movements of someone lost in a cherished memory. The other guests at the table found themselves drawn into her narrative, charmed by this glimpse of the woman behind the title. "We even tried our hand at cooking traditional Provençal dishes," Catherine continued, her laughter genuine and unguarded. "Though I must confess, my attempt at bouillabaisse was rather disastrous. The poor fishmonger of the market spent nearly an hour explaining the proper way to clean the various fish, but somehow I managed to create something that looked more like soup than the elegant dish he had described." The French ambassador chuckled appreciatively, clearly delighted by her candid confession. "Bouillabaisse is indeed a challenging dish, Your Highness. Even many French cooks struggle with the proper technique." As Catherine opened her mouth to respond with another amusing anecdote from their French adventure, she caught sight of her private secretary, James, standing discreetly near the dining room entrance. His expression was carefully neutral, but Catherine had worked with him long enough to recognize the subtle signs of concern in the slight tightening around his eyes and the almost imperceptible shake of his head. The realization hit her like a cold wave. She was doing it again, the one thing she was never, under any circumstances, allowed to do at formal dinners. She was being herself. The transformation was immediate and heartbreaking to witness. The light in Catherine's eyes dimmed, as if someone had turned down a dimmer switch. Her shoulders straightened into the perfect posture drilled into her through countless etiquette lessons. The warm, genuine smile that had illuminated her face moments before was replaced by the pleasant but distant expression that had become her default setting at royal functions. "Please forgive me," she said quietly, her voice now carrying the modulated tone of practiced diplomacy. "I seem to have gotten rather carried away with my recollections." The French ambassador looked confused by the sudden shift in her demeanor, his own smile faltering slightly. "Not at all, Your Highness. Your stories were absolutely charming. It's refreshing to meet someone who appreciates the simple pleasures of French culture." But Catherine had already retreated behind the invisible barrier that separated Princess Catherine from Kate Middleton. She nodded politely and turned her attention to the next course being served, her responses to subsequent attempts at conversation becoming increasingly formal and brief. From his position near the doorway, James watched the familiar scene unfold with a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal regret. He had been Catherine's private secretary for nearly 3 years, long enough to understand the complex dance of royal protocol that governed every aspect of her public life. His job was to ensure she never stepped out of line, never revealed too much of her authentic self, never forgot the weight of the crown she would one day wear beside her husband. Yet in quiet moments, when he thought no one was looking, James found himself mourning the vibrant, passionate woman he had glimpsed in those unguarded instances. He had seen her eyes light up when discussing her charity work with children, witnessed her genuine laughter during informal visits to local communities, and observed the way she naturally connected with people when the rigid constraints of protocol were temporarily lifted. The irony wasn't lost on him. In an age where authenticity was valued above almost everything else, where people craved genuine connection and real emotion, the future Queen of England was required to suppress the very qualities that made her most compelling and relatable. The dinner continued with its scripted politeness, each course accompanied by carefully neutral conversation about safe topics, the weather, upcoming cultural events, non-controversial aspects of international relations. Catherine played her role perfectly, smiling at appropriate moments, asking polite questions that demonstrated interest without revealing personal opinions, and maintaining the dignified composure that royal protocol demanded. But beneath the surface, something was beginning to stir. This wasn't the first time she had been silently reprimanded for allowing her authentic personality to shine through, and she suspected it wouldn't be the last. Each incident felt like a small death, a piece of herself that she was required to sacrifice on the altar of royal expectation. As the evening wore on, Catherine found her mind wandering to the early days of her relationship with William. Back then, before the engagement announcement and the subsequent avalanche of protocol training, she had been allowed to be Kate. She could laugh freely at his jokes, share her opinions on books and movies, and discuss her dreams and aspirations without wondering if her words would be dissected by palace officials or misinterpreted by the press. She remembered a particularly wonderful evening they had spent at a small pub in the Cotswolds, just the two of them tucked away in a corner booth, talking for hours about everything and nothing. William had been enchanted by her stories of her childhood, her travels, her work before they met. He had fallen in love with Kate Middleton, the woman who could debate politics with passion, who wasn't afraid to disagree with him, who brought her own unique perspective to every conversation. Now, as she sat surrounded by the opulence of the state dining room, Catherine wondered what had happened to that woman. She was still there, buried beneath layers of training and expectation, but she felt increasingly like a character in a play rather than the protagonist of her own life. The realization was both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because it meant acknowledging that she was losing pieces of herself with each passing day. Liberating because naming the problem felt like the first step toward finding a solution. As the dessert course was served, an elaborate creation involving chocolate, gold leaf, and edible flowers that looked more like art than food, Catherine made a decision. She couldn't continue like this indefinitely. Something had to change, even if she wasn't sure what that something might be. The dinner finally concluded with the traditional toasts and formal farewells. Catherine performed her duties flawlessly, shaking hands with each guest and expressing appropriate gratitude for their attendance. But as the last diplomat departed and the dining room fell silent except for the quiet efficiency of the staff clearing away the remnants of the evening, she remained seated at the table, staring at the reflection of the chandelier in her untouched wine glass. James approached cautiously, recognizing the signs of one of Catherine's contemplative moods. "Your Highness, is there anything you need before retiring for the evening?" Catherine looked up at him, and for a moment he saw something in her eyes that made him profoundly uncomfortable. Not anger or resentment, but a deep sadness that seemed to emanate from somewhere very fundamental within her. "James," she said quietly, "may I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Highness." "When you took this position, did you understand that part of your job would be to slowly erase me?" The question hung in the air between them like an accusation. James felt his carefully maintained professional composure waver slightly. "Your Highness, I'm not sure I understand what you mean." Catherine smiled, but it was tinged with melancholy. "I think you understand perfectly. The question is whether you're comfortable with it." She rose from her chair with the fluid grace that had become second nature, smoothing down her gown as she prepared to leave. But before she reached the doorway, she turned back to face him one final time. "I used to believe that being royal meant serving others while remaining true to yourself. I'm beginning to realize that I was naive to think both were possible." With that, she glided from the room, leaving James alone with the echoing silence and the uncomfortable weight of her words. As he watched her retreating figure, he found himself questioning, for the first time since accepting his position, whether protecting the institution of the monarchy was worth the cost of slowly suffocating the woman at its heart. The evening had ended as it always did, with duty fulfilled and protocol observed. But something fundamental had shifted in the space between Catherine's unguarded moment of authenticity and her forced retreat into royal reserve. A line had been crossed, a question had been raised, and there was no going back to the comfortable fiction that everything was exactly as it should be. In her private apartments later that night, as Catherine carefully removed the diamond earrings that had once belonged to Queen Mary and hung up the emerald gown that would be returned to the royal vault until the next state occasion, she caught sight of herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was perfectly composed, elegantly dressed, even in her simple nightgown, every hair still in place despite the long evening. But her eyes told a different story. They held a spark of rebellion that hadn't been there that morning, a quiet determination that suggested the careful balance between duty and authenticity was about to be tested in ways that would challenge everything she had been taught about what it meant to be royal. The one thing Princess Catherine was never allowed to do at formal dinners was be herself. But as she settled into bed that night, she found herself wondering what might happen if she decided to break that rule. The morning after the state dinner arrived with unusual fanfare. Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Sarah, entered her private study carrying a silver tray laden with newspaper clippings, her expression a mixture of concern and barely concealed excitement. The headline spoke of the previous evening's diplomatic success, but buried within the society pages was something unexpected that made Catherine's heart skip a beat. "Refreshing royal authenticity charms French ambassador," read the headline from the Times. The article, while brief, painted a glowing picture of Catherine's natural warmth and genuine enthusiasm during her conversation about France. It described her as refreshingly human and praised her ability to connect with foreign dignitaries on a personal level. Catherine set down her morning tea and read the piece twice, her emotions swinging between pride and apprehension. The positive coverage was gratifying, but she knew it would also draw unwanted attention to the very behavior she was supposed to suppress. Royal protocol existed for a reason. She had been told countless times to maintain dignity, prevent diplomatic incidents, and preserve the mystique that kept the monarchy relevant in the modern world. "Your Highness," Sarah said carefully, "there are several more articles along similar lines. The foreign press seems particularly taken with your comments about Provence." Before Catherine could respond, James appeared in the doorway, his usual composed demeanor slightly frayed around the edges. In his hands were what appeared to be printed emails and official-looking documents, none of which promised good news. "Your Highness, we need to discuss last evening's events," he said without his usual formal preamble. "I've received communications from the Lord Chamberlain's office, the Palace Press Office, and Her Majesty's private secretary." Catherine felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. "I see. And what is the consensus from the palace hierarchy?" James glanced at Sarah, who took the hint and quietly withdrew from the room, closing the study door behind her. Once they were alone, he moved closer to Catherine's desk, his voice dropping to a confidential tone that somehow made his words more ominous. "There are concerns, Your Highness. Significant concerns. He placed one of the documents on her desk. This is a memo from the protocol office outlining what they term inappropriate personal disclosure during formal state functions. They're treating last evening as a teaching moment. Catherine picked up the memo, her hands trembling slightly as she read. The language was coldly professional, but its message was unmistakable. Her spontaneous sharing about the French cottage holiday was described as conduct inconsistent with royal dignity and potentially compromising to state interests. The document went on to recommend additional training in appropriate dinner conversation and closer monitoring of personal anecdotal content. They want to monitor my personal anecdotes? Catherine's voice carried a note of disbelief. James, I was talking about buying honey at a French market, not revealing state secrets. I understand your frustration, Your Highness, but from their perspective, any personal information could be weaponized by hostile media or foreign interests. The cottage location could be identified, your security could be compromised, and your private moments could become public spectacle. Catherine stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. Below, she could see tourists gathering at the gates, their cameras ready to capture even a glimpse of royal life. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was surrounded by people desperate to see the authentic woman behind the title. Yet revealing even the smallest piece of that authenticity was treated as a security breach. What exactly are they proposing? She asked without turning from the window. James consulted another document. Enhanced protocol training with a focus on conversational boundaries. Pre-approved talking points for all state functions. And he paused, clearly uncomfortable with what came next. And a requirement that all personal anecdotes be submitted to the protocol office for approval at least 48 hours before any formal event. The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine remained motionless at the window, her reflection ghost-like in the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that James had to strain to hear her. They want to script my memories. It's not quite that extreme, Your Highness. It's more about ensuring that personal sharing aligns with royal standards and doesn't inadvertently create security risks or diplomatic complications. Catherine turned from the window, and James was struck by the transformation in her expression. The uncertainty and hurt from the previous evening had crystallized into something sharper and more determined. James, may I share something with you? Something personal that hasn't been pre-approved by the protocol office. Her tone made him nervous, but he nodded. Before I married William, I worked for my family's business. I organized children's parties and corporate events. Nothing glamorous, but I was good at it because I could connect with people. I could read a room, understand what would make guests feel welcome and engaged. Do you know why I was successful at that job? James sensed this was a rhetorical question, but he shook his head anyway. Because I was allowed to be myself. The real Kate Middleton, with all her imperfections and enthusiasms and genuine reactions. People responded to that authenticity because it made them feel comfortable being authentic too. She moved closer to her desk, her movements deliberate and controlled. Now, I'm being told that the very quality that made me effective in connecting with people is a liability that must be managed and controlled. Your Highness, surely you can see the difference between organizing a child's birthday party and representing the crown at a state dinner. Can I? Catherine's question hung in the air. Because from where I'm standing, both situations involve making people feel valued and welcome. Both require genuine human connection. The only difference is that now, apparently, genuine human connection is considered a threat to national security. James recognized the dangerous territory they were entering. Catherine's frustration was palpable, and her normally diplomatic language was giving way to something more direct and potentially problematic. As her private secretary, his job was to guide her back toward acceptance of royal protocol, not to encourage rebellion against it. Your Highness, perhaps we could view this as an opportunity to refine your natural gifts rather than suppress them. The protocol office isn't asking you to stop connecting with people, just to do so in a way that maintains appropriate boundaries. Catherine laughed, but there was no humor in it. Appropriate boundaries. Do you know what appropriate boundaries have gotten me, James? A reputation as a clothes horse who smiles beautifully, but has nothing interesting to say. The press calls me Waity Katie behind closed doors because they think I'm waiting for William to tell me what to think. The admission seemed to surprise even her, as if she hadn't realized how deeply the public perception had wounded her. James had indeed seen some of the less flattering coverage. The articles that praised Catherine's fashion choices while subtly suggesting she lacked the intellectual depth or passionate convictions of other royal women. That's not true, Your Highness, and anyone who spends time with you knows it. Your work with early childhood development shows tremendous insight and commitment. Your photography exhibitions demonstrate real artistic talent. The way you interact with children during official visits reveals genuine warmth and understanding. All carefully curated and pre-approved interactions, Catherine countered. When I speak about early childhood development, I'm reading from talking points prepared by experts. When I take photographs for exhibitions, they're reviewed by committees before being displayed. Even my interactions with children during visits are structured and time-limited to prevent any spontaneous moments that might be misinterpreted. She picked up the protocol memo again, staring at it as if it were a foreign language she was trying to decipher. Do you see what this document really represents, James? It's not about protecting me or the monarchy. It's about erasing every trace of the woman William fell in love with and replacing her with a beautiful, empty vessel that can be filled with whatever message the institution deems appropriate. The accusation stung because James recognized there was truth in it. He had watched Catherine's natural vivacity gradually dim over the years as she learned to navigate the increasingly complex web of royal expectations. Each protocol lesson, each media training session, each corrective memo had carved away another piece of her authentic self until what remained was undeniably elegant, but somehow less substantial than the woman who had first captured the prince's heart. What are you suggesting, Your Highness? That you simply ignore the protocol office's recommendations? Catherine was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her words carried the weight of a decision that had been building for months, perhaps years. I'm suggesting that I stop pretending this is sustainable. I'm suggesting that slowly disappearing as a person in order to fulfill my role as a princess isn't actually serving anyone well, including the monarchy itself. She moved to her private computer and began typing, her fingers flying across the keyboard with unusual urgency. James watched nervously, unsure whether he should intervene or simply observe what was clearly a significant moment. Your Highness, what are you doing? I'm writing a response to the protocol office memo, Catherine said without looking up from the screen. And I'm scheduling a meeting with the Queen. The words sent a chill through James. A direct appeal to the Queen over the heads of the various palace offices and advisors was virtually unprecedented for someone in Catherine's position. It was the kind of bold move that could either result in meaningful change or complete disaster, with very little middle ground between the two outcomes. Your Highness, perhaps you should take some time to consider this decision. The Queen's schedule is extraordinarily busy, and requesting an urgent meeting over what might be perceived as a minor protocol issue could be seen as what, James? Disrespectful? Presumptuous? Or perhaps as a woman refusing to quietly disappear for the sake of institutional convenience? Catherine's fingers continued their rapid movement across the keyboard as she crafted what was clearly a carefully worded but unmistakably direct message. When she finished, she read it aloud. Your Majesty, I am requesting an urgent private audience to discuss matters that I believe are fundamental to my continued effectiveness in representing the Crown. Recent protocol guidance has raised questions about the balance between institutional requirements and authentic public engagement that I feel require your personal insight and guidance. I am available at your earliest convenience and am grateful for your consideration of this request. She looked up at James, her finger hovering over the send button. This is my choice, James. I can continue to slowly fade away until there's nothing left of me but a pretty face in expensive clothes, or I can fight for the right to remain human while serving the crown. And if the Queen supports the protocol office's position, if she tells you that personal authenticity is indeed incompatible with royal duty. Catherine's expression grew solemn, but her resolve didn't waver. Then, at least I'll know where I stand. At least I'll have an honest answer instead of death by 1,000 small compromises. She pressed send before James could offer any further objections. The message disappeared into the digital ether, carrying with it the potential to reshape Catherine's entire future as a royal. In that moment, she felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated, as if she had just jumped from a cliff without knowing whether there was water or rocks below. The die was cast. For the first time since becoming a princess, Catherine had chosen confrontation over compliance, truth over convenience. She had no idea what the consequences would be, but she knew with absolute certainty that she could no longer continue down the path of gradual self-erasure that royal protocol seemed to demand. As if summoned by the weight of the moment, Sarah returned with word that lunch was being served in the private dining room. Catherine nodded absently, her mind already racing ahead to the conversation that might determine whether she would remain a vibrant participant in royal life or become merely an elegant decoration in the palace's carefully orchestrated pageantry. The afternoon stretched ahead like an eternity of waiting, each minute bringing her closer to a reckoning that would reveal whether authenticity and royal duty could coexist, or whether she had just initiated the beginning of her own royal downfall. The response from Buckingham Palace arrived faster than Catherine had dared hope. Less than 3 hours after sending her request, James appeared at her study door with an expression that mixed surprise, concern, and something that might have been admiration. "Your Highness," he said, holding up his phone, "the Queen's private secretary has confirmed an audience for 4 o'clock this afternoon. Her Majesty has cleared her schedule specifically to meet with you." Catherine felt her stomach drop. The speed of the response suggested that her message had struck a nerve, though whether that was good or bad remained to be seen. She had hoped for a meeting, but the reality of actually sitting across from the Queen to discuss her rebellion against royal protocol felt suddenly overwhelming. Did they give any indication of Her Majesty's disposition regarding the matter? Catherine asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "None whatsoever. Simply that you should be prepared for a substantive conversation, and that no one else is to be present. No private secretaries, no protocol officers, no advisors. Just you and Her Majesty." The implications of a completely private audience were not lost on Catherine. Such meetings were reserved for the most sensitive matters, situations that required absolute discretion, and could not risk being influenced by the various court officials who typically managed royal interactions. The Queen was either taking her concerns seriously enough to warrant extraordinary privacy, or she was planning to deliver a reprimand so severe that witnesses would be inappropriate. Catherine spent the remaining time until her appointment in a state of controlled anxiety, changing her outfit 3 times before settling on a navy blue dress that struck the right balance between respect and confidence. She rehearsed possible openings for the conversation, trying to find words that would convey her frustration without sounding petulant or disrespectful. The walk to the Queen's private study felt interminable despite lasting only a few minutes. Catherine passed through corridors lined with portraits of her predecessors, women who had navigated the complex demands of royal life with varying degrees of success. Some had thrived within the system's constraints, while others had been broken by them. She wondered which category she would ultimately fall into. When she was finally shown into the Queen's study, Catherine was struck by how different the space felt without the usual retinue of officials. The room, with its comfortable furnishings and personal photographs, suddenly seemed more like a grandmother's sitting room than the seat of monarchical power. The Queen sat behind her desk, but she gestured for Catherine to take the chair directly across from her rather than the more formal seating arrangement typically used for official meetings. "Catherine," the Queen said simply, "please sit down. I understand you have concerns about recent protocol guidance. The directness of the approach caught Catherine slightly off guard. She had expected formal pleasantries, a gradual working up to the substance of her complaint. Instead, the Queen's manner suggested she wanted to cut straight to the heart of the matter. "Yes, Your Majesty. Thank you for making time to see me so quickly. I hope you don't consider my request inappropriate." "On the contrary," the Queen replied, her tone warmer than Catherine had anticipated. "I consider it overdue. Please, tell me exactly what prompted your message. I want to understand your perspective fully before we discuss potential solutions." Catherine took a deep breath and began to recount the events of the previous evening, from her spontaneous sharing about the French cottage to James's warning glance and her subsequent retreat into formal reserve. She described the protocol memo and its recommendations for scripting her personal anecdotes, her growing sense that she was being asked to disappear as a person in order to succeed as a princess. "The hardest part," Catherine continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, "is feeling that the very qualities William valued in me when we were dating are now seen as liabilities. My ability to connect with people, my enthusiasm for simple pleasures, my tendency to share personal experiences that help others feel comfortable. All of these are apparently inappropriate for someone in my position." The Queen listened without interruption, her expression revealing nothing of her thoughts. When Catherine finished, silence settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Catherine waited, her heart pounding, for the judgment that would determine her future within the royal family. "May I share something with you, Catherine?" the Queen finally said. "Something that I learned many years ago when I was struggling with similar questions about authenticity and duty." Catherine nodded, surprised by the personal turn the conversation was taking. "When I became queen at 25, I was told by the court officials of that era that successful monarchs were essentially blank slates upon which the institution could project whatever image was needed for any given situation. I was advised to suppress my personal opinions, to avoid revealing my preferences or enthusiasms, to become a sort of beautiful cipher who could represent the crown without the complication of individual personality." The parallel to Catherine's own experience was striking and somewhat comforting. "How did you respond to that guidance, Your Majesty?" "Initially, I tried to follow it. For several years, I attempted to become the emotionless figure they wanted me to be. Do you know what happened?" Catherine shook her head. "I became profoundly unhappy, and, more importantly, it became ineffective. The public sensed my detachment and responded with their own indifference. It wasn't until I began to selectively reveal glimpses of my authentic self, my love for horses, my dedication to duty, my genuine concern for my subjects, that people began to connect with the monarchy in a meaningful way. This revelation was entirely unexpected. The Queen had always seemed to Catherine to embody perfect royal composure, to have mastered the balance between personal and public in a way that made it appear effortless. "But, Your Majesty, you've always seemed so naturally suited to the constraints of royal protocol." The Queen smiled, and for a moment, Catherine glimpsed the young woman who had struggled with the same impossible demands. "That's because I learned to choose my moments of authenticity carefully, and I fought very hard to ensure that those moments were protected and respected by my staff." "You fought?" "Oh, my dear, I fought battles that would make your current situation seem like a minor skirmish. There were officials who wanted to control everything from my facial expressions during public appearances to the topics I was allowed to discuss in private conversations with heads of state. I had to establish boundaries, to insist that authentic engagement was not just compatible with royal duty, but essential to it." Catherine felt a surge of hope mixed with trepidation. "And how did you manage to convince them?" "By demonstrating that authenticity, properly channeled, was actually more effective than artificial perfection. When people see genuine emotion from a royal, when they witness real passion for causes or authentic enjoyment of simple pleasures, it creates connection and loyalty that no amount of scripted performance can achieve." The Queen rose from her desk and moved to the window, gazing out at the gardens with a contemplative expression. "The challenge, Catherine, is not whether you should be authentic. That question has already been answered by your success with the public when you are allowed to be yourself. The challenge is how to create space for that authenticity within a system that has grown increasingly risk-averse and controlling over the years. What are you suggesting, Your Majesty? The Queen turned back to face her, and Catherine saw something in her expression that looked remarkably like mischief. I'm suggesting that we remind the Protocol Office that they serve the monarchy, not the other way around. I'm suggesting that we establish new guidelines that protect your right to authentic engagement while addressing their legitimate concerns about security and diplomatic sensitivity. Catherine felt her heart begin to race. You're saying you support my position? I'm saying that a princess who can charm a French ambassador by sharing genuine enthusiasm for his country is infinitely more valuable to the crown than a princess who recites approved talking points about cultural exchange. I'm saying that your ability to connect with people is not a flaw to be managed, but a gift to be treasured and properly utilized. The relief that washed over Catherine was so intense, she felt momentarily dizzy. For months, she had questioned whether she was being unreasonable, whether her desire to remain authentic was simply incompatible with royal responsibility. To have the Queen not only understand but actively support her position felt like emerging from a dark tunnel into brilliant sunlight. What happens now? Catherine asked. Now, the Queen said, returning to her seat with evident satisfaction, we implement some changes that are long overdue. First, we're going to revise the protocol guidelines to distinguish between inappropriate personal disclosure and authentic human engagement. Second, we're going to establish clear boundaries around what constitutes necessary security protection versus unnecessary control of your personality. And third, we're going to make it very clear to all palace staff that supporting your authentic engagement with the public is part of their job, not an obstacle to it. Catherine felt tears prick her eyes. Your Majesty, I can't tell you how much this means to me. Oh, but I understand completely because I remember how it felt to believe that serving the crown required sacrificing everything that made me who I was. That was never the intention, Catherine, and it should never be the result. The Queen paused, her expression growing more serious. However, I want to be clear about something. With greater freedom comes greater responsibility. You'll need to develop judgment about when personal sharing serves the crown's interests and when it might create complications. You'll need to work with James and the security team to ensure that your spontaneity doesn't inadvertently create risks. And you'll need to understand that some people will always prefer the safer option of rigid protocol, so you'll face resistance even after we implement these changes. Catherine nodded eagerly. I understand completely. I'm not asking for the right to say anything to anyone at any time. I'm just asking for the space to be human while serving the crown. Then, we are in complete agreement, the Queen said. Now, I believe we should invite James to join us so we can begin implementing these changes immediately. I want new protocol guidelines drafted within the week, and I want a meeting scheduled with all relevant palace officials to ensure everyone understands a new approach. As the Queen reached for her phone to summon James, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine excitement about her royal future. For the first time since her wedding, she could envision a path that honored both her duty to the crown and her need to remain authentically herself. The meeting that followed, with James and eventually several other senior palace officials, was unlike anything Catherine had experienced in her royal career. Rather than being lectured about protocol violations, she found herself at the center of a collaborative effort to redesign the system that governed her public interactions. The new guidelines that emerged would protect her right to authentic engagement while establishing clear boundaries around security and diplomatic sensitivity. More importantly, they would require palace staff to actively support rather than suppress the qualities that made her effective at connecting with people. As Catherine left the Queen's study that evening, she felt lighter than she had in years. The one thing she had never been allowed to do at formal dinners, be herself, was about to become not just permissible, but actively encouraged. The real test would come at the next state function, when she would discover whether the theoretical support for authenticity would translate into practical freedom to connect with people as herself rather than as a carefully scripted version of royal perfection. 3 weeks later, the grand banquet hall at Windsor Castle buzzed with anticipation as guests arrived for a state dinner honoring the visiting Chancellor of Germany and her delegation. Catherine stood before her bedroom mirror, adjusting the sapphire necklace that had belonged to Princess Diana, her hands steady despite the significance of the evening ahead. This would be her first formal dinner since the Queen's revolutionary protocol changes, and she was acutely aware that every word she spoke would be scrutinized for evidence of her newfound freedom to be authentic. James appeared in the doorway, but his demeanor was markedly different from 3 weeks earlier. Gone was the nervous tension that had characterized his supervision of her public appearances. In its place was something that looked remarkably like eager anticipation. "Your Highness, the German delegation has specifically requested to be seated near you this evening. It seems your reputation for engaging conversation has preceded you." Catherine smiled, remembering a time when such a request would have filled her with dread rather than excitement. "I suppose we should give him something worth talking about, then." "Indeed. And, Your Highness," James paused, his expression sincere, "I want you to know how much I'm looking forward to seeing the real Catherine in action tonight. These past weeks, working with the new protocol guidelines, have reminded me why I was honored to accept this position in the first place." The transformation in James had been one of the unexpected benefits of the Queen's intervention. Rather than being tasked with suppressing Catherine's personality, he now served as a collaborator in helping her navigate authentic engagement within appropriate boundaries. The change had energized him in ways Catherine hadn't anticipated, turning him from a reluctant enforcer of restrictions into an enthusiastic facilitator of genuine connection. As they made their way to the reception area, Catherine felt a familiar flutter of nerves, but it was tempered by excitement rather than dread. For the first time in her royal career, she was approaching a state function with the freedom to be herself, and the sensation was both liberating and slightly overwhelming. The German Chancellor, Dr. Angela Weber, proved to be a formidable but warm presence who immediately put Catherine at ease with her direct manner and obvious intelligence. As they were seated for dinner, Catherine found herself genuinely curious about the Chancellor's perspective on European cooperation and climate initiatives. "Dr. Weber," Catherine began, feeling a thrill at the simple act of pursuing her own genuine interests, "I've been following Germany's renewable energy initiatives with great fascination. The transition seems remarkably comprehensive, but I imagine there must be significant challenges that don't make it into the international coverage." The Chancellor's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone accustomed to discussing policy in abstract terms who had suddenly encountered someone interested in practical realities. "Your Highness, you've identified exactly the issue that keeps me awake at night. The technical achievements are indeed impressive, but the human element of transition is far more complex than our media coverage suggests." Catherine leaned forward, her interest genuine and obvious. "Could you give me an example? I find that understanding the human impact of policy changes is crucial to seeing the complete picture." "Certainly. Take the coal mining regions of the Ruhr Valley. We can install all the solar panels and wind turbines we want, but if we don't successfully retrain 50,000 coal miners for new industries, we're not just implementing energy policy, we're destroying communities." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Catherine had experienced at a royal function. Dr. Weber shared detailed stories of visiting former mining towns, of meeting with workers whose families had extracted coal for generations, of the delicate balance between environmental necessity and economic survival. Catherine found herself contributing her own observations from visits to British communities facing similar transitions, drawing parallels that clearly engaged and impressed the Chancellor. "You know," Dr. Weber said during a brief pause in their discussion, "this is exactly the kind of substantive conversation I'd hoped for this evening, but rarely experience at diplomatic functions. Usually, state dinners involve pleasant but superficial exchanges about cultural landmarks and historical treaties. Catherine felt a surge of validation. I must confess, I share your preference for meaningful dialogue over ceremonial pleasantries. There's something deeply satisfying about discussing issues that genuinely matter to the people we serve. As the evening progressed, Catherine discovered that her authentic engagement created a ripple effect throughout the dinner. Other guests, observing the substantive nature of her conversation with the Chancellor, began to abandon their own scripted diplomatic small talk in favor of more genuine exchanges. The atmosphere in the dining hall shifted from formal courtesy to vibrant intellectual engagement. During the fish course, Catherine found herself in conversation with the German Minister of Education about early childhood development programs. Her own expertise in this area, usually constrained by pre-approved talking points, flowed freely as she described her visits to British nursery schools and her observations about the correlation between early intervention and long-term educational success. Princess Catherine, the education minister said with evident surprise, your understanding of developmental psychology is remarkably sophisticated. Have you been involved in educational policy development? Not in any official capacity, Catherine replied honestly, but it's an area where I've done extensive personal research because I find it genuinely compelling. I believe that understanding how children learn and develop is fundamental to creating a society that truly serves everyone's potential. The conversation that followed delved into neuroscience research, international comparative studies, and the intersection of child development with social policy. Catherine found herself discussing complex ideas with a confidence that came from genuine knowledge and passion, a stark contrast to the careful recitation of briefing notes that had characterized her previous diplomatic interactions. What surprised her most was how her authenticity seemed to unlock similar genuineness in others. The German officials, freed from the expectation of maintaining diplomatic distance, began sharing personal anecdotes and professional challenges that revealed them as complex, thoughtful individuals rather than merely representatives of state policy. During the meat course, Chancellor Weber turned to Catherine with a contemplative expression. Your Highness, may I make an observation? Of course. In my 20 years of international diplomacy, I have attended dozens of state dinners. Most are exercises in careful politeness, where everyone says appropriate things that convey no real information and create no lasting impression. Tonight, however, I find myself in conversations that I will remember and build upon long after I return to Berlin. You have created an atmosphere where authentic dialogue is not just possible, but encouraged. Catherine felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the wine. Thank you, Chancellor. That means more to me than you might realize. I suspect I understand exactly what you mean, Dr. Weber replied with a knowing smile. The pressure to maintain perfect diplomatic composure can be suffocating, particularly for women in prominent positions. There's an assumption that authenticity and authority are somehow incompatible. You've experienced similar expectations? Oh, my dear, I spent my first 5 years as Chancellor trying to become a carefully controlled cipher who never revealed personal opinions or showed genuine emotion. It was exhausting and completely ineffective. I didn't begin to succeed until I started treating other world leaders as intelligent human beings rather than political abstractions and allowed them to see me as the same. The parallel to Catherine's own journey was so precise that she felt momentarily breathless. How did you find the courage to make that change? I realized that the choice was between being authentic and effective or controlled and irrelevant. Once I understood that my genuine engagement actually served my country's interests better than diplomatic theater, the decision became simple. As the dinner moved toward its conclusion, Catherine reflected on the transformation that had occurred not just in her own experience, but in the entire dynamic of the evening. The room buzzed with animated conversation, laughter that sounded spontaneous rather than polite, and the kind of intellectual energy that typically characterized private gatherings among friends rather than formal state functions. James, observing from his position near the wall, wore an expression of profound satisfaction. The evening represented a complete vindication of the Queen's faith in Catherine's authentic engagement. Rather than creating diplomatic incidents or security concerns, her genuine personality had elevated the entire event to a level of substantive exchange that would likely strengthen British-German relations in meaningful ways. As the evening wound down and guests prepared to depart, Chancellor Weber took Catherine's hand in both of hers. "Your Highness, thank you for an extraordinary evening. I hope we will have opportunities to continue our conversations in the future." "I will be delighted, Chancellor. Perhaps when you're next in London, we could arrange a more informal meeting to discuss educational initiatives in greater detail." "I would be honored." And Catherine, the Chancellor said, dropping the formal address for the first time, "Never let anyone convince you that authenticity is incompatible with duty. Tonight proved that your genuine engagement serves your country better than any amount of diplomatic performance ever could." After the last guests had departed and the staff had begun clearing the dining hall, Catherine found herself alone with James, reviewing the evening's success. The contrast with her state of mind after the French dinner 3 weeks earlier was striking. "Your Highness," James said, his voice carrying genuine emotion, "tonight was remarkable. I've never seen diplomatic guests respond so positively to a royal function." The German delegation was clearly impressed, not just with your knowledge, but with your authentic interest in meaningful dialogue. Catherine smiled, feeling more at peace with her royal role than she had since her wedding day. It's amazing what happens when you're allowed to actually care about the people you're meeting and the subjects you're discussing. The Queen was right, wasn't she? Authenticity isn't a liability to be managed. It's an asset to be treasured. "More than that," Catherine replied, gazing around the now empty dining hall where she had just experienced the most satisfying royal function of her career. "It's the difference between being a decorative figurehead and being someone who can actually contribute to the important conversations that shape our world." As they left the banquet hall together, Catherine felt a profound sense of resolution. The one thing she had never been allowed to do at formal dinners, be herself, had not only been permitted but had transformed the entire nature of diplomatic engagement. She had proven that authenticity and royal duty were not opposing forces but complementary aspects of effective service to the crown. The journey from suppression to authentic engagement hadn't been easy, and she suspected there would be future challenges as she navigated this new freedom. But tonight had demonstrated beyond doubt that the woman William had fallen in love with and the princess the British people needed could indeed be the same person. Walking through the corridors of Windsor Castle, Catherine felt a deep satisfaction that came from knowing she no longer had to choose between being herself and serving her country. In finding the courage to fight for her authentic voice, she had discovered that it was not just compatible with royal duty, but essential to fulfilling it with genuine excellence. The one thing Princess Catherine was never allowed to do at formal dinners had become the thing that made her most effective at them. In the end, the greatest service she could provide to the crown was not the sacrifice of her authentic self, but its careful and courageous expression in service of others.